Hello, Ron. Today we are joined by Gareth Lynn Montes, who is an editor at Tank Encyclopedia website and also at the Tank Encyclopedia magazine. He is originally from Spain, and so he has some insights on the Spanish Civil War because he can actually read and speak Spanish. Additionally, he has a master's in international relations. So, welcome, Gareth.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
And today we will talk about armored cars in the Spanish Civil War. So we talked a bit previously, and you mentioned that in Spain they have a rather long history. So can you give us a brief overview about the origins and the time before the Spanish Civil War?
Absolutely. And I think it's very important because, well, Spain was one of the first countries or states rather to use armored cars in a field of conflict. And that came in 1911, so even before World War One, when during the Melilla War, which was fought in North Africa, uh, uh, they used some French vehicles called the Snider Brilliers, and they were based on some buses of all vehicles that used to be used in Paris. So that was the first ever use that Spain did of armored vehicles, and as far as and I'm not sure if it's exactly the first ever use of armored cars in a field of conflict, but it's one of the first. And so that's the origin. And for the next few decades, Spanish armored vehicles would follow suit as vehicles to be used in the North African conflict. They were followed in 1921. By this time, it was the Rif War. Spain had lost the Battle of Anual in the summer of 1921, one of the biggest disasters in Spanish military history, against what was perceived to be as a completely uncivilized and untrained tribes of the Rif. And to fight these tribes, they decided to invest a lot of money in military vehicles, and they got vehicles from France, but they also developed their own armored cars. And there was a lot of private initiatives. There was this journalist called Leopoldo Romeo who presented his own vehicle for the conflict, but in the end, the ones who built the most vehicles were the communications unit within the army, which may seem a very bizarre unit within the army to do it to develop armored vehicles, but after all, they were the ones who had vehicles to build armor on top of, because they were the ones that were used to for all communications between different elements in the army. So they built these vehicles, and they are called Blindados Modelo 1921, and there was 5 different chassis. And the idea was that you just build an armored cover on them. What made them different?
So they were basically still all converted vehicles from non-armored ones. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So there was, yes, just lorries, trucks, put an armor on top of them. What made these different though from the earlier vehicles is that most of them had a turret, which was the first time that Spain used turrets on armored cars. But still, the main purpose for these vehicles was for convoy duties. So to prevent because of the distances in North Africa between the Spanish enclaves and the fortifications, you'd have large convoys transporting food, water mainly, quite a dry area, even if it's not the desert. But still, so they needed to protect them, because that was what they were guerrilla fighters after all. Most of these tribes in North Africa, so you needed vehicles they were mainly dissuade any attack. So that was the purpose of it. They were used in offensive actions as well, and the whole units that operated them received the highest condecoration of the Spanish army. So yeah, and then they extended also to the use in times of peace, and I use peace in a very broad sense of the word, because the Spain in the early 20th century was not a peaceful period, and that was before the Spanish Civil War.
So from my understanding is they were used a lot to protect lines of communication. So in a way they were similarly used to what armored trains were used, if I understand this correctly. Because they were also
Yes.
used for logistics and other parts, and in areas where you have large distances around this.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. And but yeah, so there was a very much these vehicles, once the war in the Rif had been finished by 1925-26, they were all taken all back. Most of them were taken back to Spain. And again, I said Spain was not peaceful at all. There were a lot of demonstrations. There were a lot of there was a coup, It wasn't really a good time. So lots of these vehicles were used as dissuasive to protesters, to demonstrators. But what that led to the notion that they needed a dedicated vehicle that would be able to fulfill duties, at least civilian police duties. And that led to, once the Spanish Second Republic had been proclaimed in 1931, to a vehicle called the Bilbao Modelo 1932. And there were several vehicles which competed for this place to be this security vehicle, but in the end it was this design, which again was turreted. It was a very tall vehicle, but again, and lots of the time it was mainly to be a dissuasive element. But with these Bilbao Modelo 1932, they played a second role, which was probably quite interesting. They ended up equipping this group of self-propelled machine gun vehicles, which in Spanish is Grupo de Autoametralladoras. But to make it even more complicated, although it's called self-propelled machine gun vehicles, the name also adds at the end in Spanish cañón, which means cannon. So the actual translation would be self-propelled machine gun based vehicles cannon. So it is it makes very little sense, but they were used for this purpose, and that was something that for about 5, 6, 7 years, Spain had been looking for a specific armored vehicle to fulfill this role, which wasn't a tank. So one of the other vehicles they'd considered before that was the French AMC Citroën Cagresse, which is one of these weird half-track vehicles that the French developed in the 1930s. Which was cannon equipped. So I guess that's one of the origins of why the unit ended up with that name. But that was never purchased, and they used these vehicles instead. So those were probably their first vehicles that were designed to, or once they were designed to, were used or assigned to be an individual armored car company rather than just go alongside police duties or convoy duties.
Now, since we got basically the origin story down, now the question is, how were armored cars employed in the Spanish Civil War? So basically the organization, mission, tactics, so broad sense. I mean, there's probably not that much data around like compared to other stuff. So basically what some questions would be interesting, was there a difference between how the nationalists and the Republican forces used them? And I know there were more forces and a bit more complex. For the sake of brevity and sanity of all of us involved, we keep them, for the viewers now, we keep them to Republican and nationalist. But if you have more specific, then you can explain or add this. But for me, I keep it at this point because, well, if we go down that rabbit hole of all the factions of the Spanish Civil War, the video probably take half an hour longer.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very good, simplistic yet effective way of defining them. And I said it could be a half an hour long video just explaining the factions that made up it. But no, and I think to understand, I think how Spain used armored cars or armored vehicles before the Spanish Civil War is very indicative of how they were used after, during especially the early days of the Spanish Civil War. Because of what was available, you had a few old vehicles that were designed in 1921. These ones that were designed by the communications units within the army. Some of those were still around. Very few of them, they did take part in the early stage of the coup and then the counter coup. And you had some of these Bilbao armored cars, which again were originally designed for police duties, but were probably one of the most modern vehicles in the Spanish army at the time. So that was what was there at the very beginning. What happened was that, especially on the Republican side, the more, again, in this early stage, very revolutionary Republican side of workers' militias and whatnot, they decided to make a lot of these improvised armored vehicles, and they've become so common in Spanish that they've got the word in the Spanish language to describe them, and they're called tiznados or tiznados, which comes from the word, the Spanish word for sooty, which means because the vehicles were covered in grease, so they got this blackish color, and that was how these vehicles, because the belief was that if you put grease on them, they'd be better at deterring bullets. And you'd had some of these vehicles before in 1934 when there was a big uprising in Asturias, in the north of Spain, anarchist miners, mainly anarchist miners uprising. But lots of these vehicles were built in the early stages of the Civil War. And again, it was mainly just to have some kind of heavier support. I mean, lots of the time were just trucks, even even automobiles, just normal cars that were just given, just put some metal sheets on them, and just some of them were given a turret, most of them weren't. And and just to get an idea of how many were built, up to 1937, in Catalonia alone, around 200 of these vehicles were built. And once you consider the numbers in the Basque Country, Valencia, Asturias, and even Madrid, which were big hubs, like the numbers of these improvised armored cars, again, armored cars in a very broad sense of the word, you would have about, just on the Republican side, about 300, 400 builds of these. And the main use of these was their combat value was limited because, again, the improvised nature they were built, some of them were on very unreliable chassis. But the idea was that they could transport troops inside them. So they were very much sort of more like armored personnel carriers rather than armored cars in the traditional sense. And it was just more the idea of we need to build something to fight. Because again, the Republic especially most of the army sided with the coup, with what would become the nationalists. And where the Republic was, a lot of it was the workers, and of course their experience was in industry, so that hence they could build these vehicles because most of the industrial centers sided with the Republic. So that was probably in the early stages of the war. You had very much of infantry support vehicles, but again, how much support they could actually provide, it was questionable at times. But you had some absolutely bizarre looking vehicles built in and completely mechanically unreliable vehicles. And I know the Bob Semple tank from New Zealand has become a bit of a meme in the tank community. Well, in Spain there wasn't just one, there were just like hundreds, mainly armored cars though. And as the war progressed, obviously these vehicles became far less common. The ones built in Barcelona, in Catalonia, but mainly in Barcelona, did develop into more serious designs once they'd started building a few of them, and you did have some vehicles which had some effective combat value. But still, it was mainly infantry support, and it wasn't until you did get some of those vehicles that came from the Soviet Union mainly, and some of the ones that were built in Spain at later stages of the war and did have proper designs, that they were used slightly differently. And again, I think one of the main differences there is that some of these earlier ones when they had a turret, it was equipped with a machine gun, whereas some of the Soviet ones, so the BA-3 and the BA-6, had a cannon, which was a 45mm gun, which was on vehicles, it was as big a caliber as you'd get in the Spanish Civil War. So it was very much a change there. And there was also reconnaissance, and I think that's something the Italians learned. Even the Italians with their volunteer force in the war, they made use of a lot of these armored Spanish and Russian and Soviet rather armored vehicles because they could use them for reconnaissance, whereas their own vehicles were a bit lacking in that department. But yeah, so I think that was, and when it comes to the differences between the two sides, it was at the end of the day, both sides were using the same vehicles. Because although the Republic did get all these fancier, more modern Soviet vehicles, and they were developing their own vehicles, what the nationalists did most of the time was just capture them and reuse them. They did it's famously known how much they did it with tanks, especially with the T-26, but they did it a lot with armored vehicles as well.
So similar to the Germans, like they had more in the First World War, they had more captured tanks, as far as I know, than home-built ones as well. Yeah.
Yeah, very similar. Yeah, very similar.
So now, for the tanks, the majority we know were sent from foreign countries, like particularly Soviet Union with about 300, Italy with 150, Germany with about 120. So with the armored cars, they were far less sent, I assume, or yeah. So yeah. I think Germany didn't send at all. I think they only sent tanks. And you mentioned the Soviet Union sent a few types.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was completely different. Like the majority of armored cars, and again, in a very broad sense of the word armored car, were Spanish made. You had these improvised ones, these Nauers, and you had the more proper designs. But yes, Germany didn't send any armored cars as such. They did send some half tracks that were used for towing artillery pieces, but just apart from that, tanks and a lot of support vehicles of trucks and staff cars and whatnot. But when it came, when it came to armored cars, again in the more traditional sense of armored cars, you did have Italy provided some. They provided some of the World War I era Lancia IZ or IZM cars. Only 8 of those arrived in December 1936, and they were not liked at all. They were considered to be obsolete. Hence the Italians ended up using a lot of captured Soviet and Spanish material. The Soviet Union sent the FAI, the FAI armored cars, a very small number, and those were very unsuccessful. They were used mainly as staff cars, as communication cars, even though they had a turret and could be considered to be quite modern for this conflict. The armored cars that were the far most successful were the Soviet BA3 and BA6s. There was only about 4 BA3s. BA6s, 26 arrived in 1936, followed by some more in 1937. There's no exact number. And very much, again, they had a 45mm gun, which was in Spanish Civil War standards. You're talking Top Gun there.
Yeah, that's pretty big at that time.
and they were very much used as mobile gun platforms, and they were used for the first time, or their first major usage or predominant usage was in the Battle of Madrid, when nationalist forces are sieging Madrid at the end of 1936. And these armored cars with a 45mm gun appear and just shoot at everything, and can destroy the Panzer Is and the Italian CV-33s. And it's very much, this is the new top vehicle, obviously as well with the tanks, the T-26s. But yeah, very reduced, and probably one of the most interesting vehicles that partook in the whole Spanish Civil War was an armored car of Portuguese origin. Because although Portugal never intervened in the Spanish Civil War, there were a group of about 10,000 Portuguese volunteers that fought in the Spanish Civil War with the nationalists. And one of these cars was built on a Ford chassis, and there's only 2 existing photographs on it, and in each one of the photographs it has a different machine gun. So it's either thought that it's 2 different vehicles, or that at some point the vehicle changed its machine gun. But yeah, that's probably the most exciting and exotic vehicle, that armored car at least, that partook in the Civil War.
So, from your opinion, what is the most important armored car of the Spanish Civil War, and why? I mean, there seems to be a lot. I mean, you say that the Soviet ones apparently were quite effective, but also from. So, what would you consider the most important one?
I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to choose 2, because I think you can't think of them one without the other. And these are the Spanish-made ones. And again, I may be a bit biased because I've done a lot of research into them, but it's there's one vehicle, and again, it's very complex because they've been given many names throughout history, throughout the last 50, 60 years, and most of the names that they're given in the literature are wrong. So one of them,
I know that problem.
yeah, one of the vehicles, which was it's usually known as the UNL 35, though that name, there's no documentation from the Civil War which supports that name. And the vehicle is normally known in sources as the Blindado Tipo CIS, as in ZIS, as in the Soviet-made trucks. But the vehicles have also been known as Blindado Tipo 3HC, which is the using the Latin script, or what these vehicles were known in the Soviet Union. So it gets a bit complicated with the names, and not all of these vehicles were built on a Soviet chassis. That's because some of them have right-hand drive, so they were clearly built on a British vehicle. So, but these vehicles were built in Spain, and with Soviet help. How much Soviet help there was, it's been debated. Some say that they were just some the plans for the vehicle were developed by Soviet officials and Soviet technical assistants. Others say that they produced a lot of the vehicles. It's quite debated how much Soviet influence was. There clearly was some, but these vehicles were based on Soviet designs like the BA3 and the BA6, and were built in big numbers. About 160 of these vehicles, of the Blindado Tipo Cs, were built in Spain. And again, Spain, which is again often ridiculized for these improvised armored cars built during the Spanish Civil War. These were proper designs and used in big numbers by by the Republicans, by the Nationalists who captured them and then were used in France during the early stage of World War II, doing a very reduced role. However, this vehicle was a bit light. It was only equipped with one turret with a machine gun. So then they developed a heavier vehicle, and this one was much more strongly resembled the BA6 because it was equipped with a cannon. And sometimes most of them were equipped with a 37mm gun, a French gun, but some of them used turrets from knocked out T-26s. So it had a 45mm gun. And this vehicle in the literature, it's normally known as the AAC 1936, 1937. Again, names differ. No, these names were never used in official documentation during the Spanish Civil War, and the vehicle was known in the Spanish Civil War as Blindado Modelo B.C. So again, and these vehicles were, although only 70 of them were built, they probably had the longest career, and they very poorly documented in Spain their involvement in the Spanish Civil War. And although it was a Republican vehicle, most of the fixture of it that exists are seeing the vehicle knocked out or in nationalist colors once they were captured, because by that point it was the documentation of Republican armor, and Republican forces in general post 1937 and definitely 1938 is very poor. But these vehicles then served in France and were used by French forces in World War II. And then the vehicles were captured by Germans and used in the Eastern Front. And one of these vehicles was even converted to have an anti-aircraft quad machine gun where the turret used to be. So they just for the longevity, for several reasons, I'd say they're the most important. Just because of the sheer numbers built of them. I said 160 of the lighter model and around 70 of the heavier model in a country that had no experience of having built armored vehicles in any significant numbers before. And again, doing a civil war. And because they went on to serve until 1940, until after Operation Barbarossa, some of these. And again, going back to the numbers, just for context, Spain didn't serially build anything in those numbers into the 1970s when they built their licensed copy of the AMX-30, the AMX-30E, E for España, Spain, and the Blindado Medios de Sobre Ruedas, a Spanish armored car. So it took into the 1970s for Spain to get close to building in those numbers again. And again, these were for the most part sturdy vehicles. That didn't just they weren't amateurs building them. They were proper vehicles. So I'd say, because for all those reasons, they are, in my opinion, the most important vehicles.
I'm convinced. So a few follow-up questions. One aspect of particular interest, which is not directly related to the armored cars, is you mentioned that the documentation on the Republican side in 1937 and 1938 went down. Do you know why, or what is the common explanation here?
Yes, there is. So there is a load of pictures of the early days of the war. So and I know this is quite well documented by Orwell, George Orwell, in Homage to Catalonia, where he says that in 1936, when he was in Barcelona, was the revolutionary fervor and all that. So all the journalists all across Europe were quite keen to see what was going on in Spain. So a lot of journalists came and took a load of pictures and whatnot. And you had the international brigades that came and went to Spain and then took the pictures and brought them back to wherever they were from all across the world, really. Once the war started to go very badly for the Republic, there wasn't so much there wasn't so much evidence of photographs and whatnot. You did have a lot in Teruel, the Battle of Teruel in late 1937, early 1938, where there is a load of pictures of Republican forces, because it was an early success. So they invited all the world journalists to come and take pictures. Then it didn't go so well, so the journalists left. But so by that point, once especially the Republic was quite clearly going to lose the war, it was a long defeat. For the general population, having photographs or documentation became, quite a dangerous game to play. And it's ironic that we cover in this, because obviously in Afghanistan we're seeing quite a similar thing at the moment, that of deleting photos from your phones, or just to get rid of your past life. And I guess it was very much a similar thing in Spain in 1938, 1939. So, and documentation, obviously, in Catalonia, which fell during the war in February, March 1939, there was very much of just destroy all documents. Just don't let them fall into enemy hands. So there was very much of that. There was I think to sum up, it's that revolutionary fervor and interest in Spain way disappeared a bit. Obviously, in Europe, you had the Munich Agreement and the German annexation of the Sudetenland that was happening in 1938. So that was the main focus for journalists and whatnot, and that's to have evidence of involvements with the Republicans could result in you being imprisoned or worse.
Okay, that's very interesting. I asked because I heard for the German side as well, so for Germany in the Second World War, that the number of photos basically around 1943 just sticks a nosedive that we have. So private photos and everything, it just, before it's there are a lot, and then later war, it just goes down. So it's probably also a bit related to who is winning or not. So,
yeah, ironically, lots of the photos that exist of the Spanish Civil War are photos by members of the Condor Legion. So yeah, private photos from members from Germans fighting on the nationalist side in the Civil War. Loads of pictures are through them. So yeah, it's quite interesting in that aspect.
So the other question is, you mentioned that they also, and I understood it correctly, some of these armored cars ended up on the Eastern Front and also on the French side. So how did they get out there? So for the French, for continental French or North Africa French territories, or how they call?
Yeah, that is probably a good one to explain a little bit. In 1939, when in 1938, go a bit further back. In 1938, the northeast part of Spain, where Catalonia is, was cut off from the rest of the republic, and so there was still a lot of military vehicles there, and there was a lot of vehicles that were built in that side, but they were very much alone. So if they wanted to retreat from the advancing nationalist forces, they couldn't retreat. You had the sea on one side, and then you were surrounded by the nationalists. What you had was France, and although France had closed the border and opened it at different points, it was mainly closed. But just so what happened when the nationalist forces were advancing and the Republican army was in retreat, they just went north to France, and France did open the border, and a ridiculous amount of refugees, like hundreds, thousands, just crossed into France over 3-4 days, and lots of them brought with them their vehicles, and some of them were given back. A number of T-26s were given back to Spain by France, but a lot of the armored cars, and again, some of the ones that were built in Barcelona, some of the improvised armored cars, again, some more of the refined models rather than the crude early ones. But again, a number of these Blindado B.C and Blindado Modelo B.C. It's not quite clear how many crossed the border, but there are pictures of French depots with about 12, 15 vehicles. It's not sure if those are older vehicles or more were taken, but yeah, so they were captured in southern France and then redistributed. I think that the lighter model, the one with the machine gun, was originally intended for French colonial service, but they were never actually sent out because of the short space between April 1939 and then the war started in Europe. But the heavier model was considered to be a good enough model for the French to put into service. I'm not an expert on French military operations during World War II. I think they were used on the Belgian-French border to oppose to German troops, but yeah, that's how they got to France in the first place.
So if the French used them, this also supports your view on them, that they were the most important ones, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is evidence, not just the French using them and then the Germans using them, that they were good enough vehicles. They weren't a joke like some of the other vehicles built in Spain during the Civil War. They were proper vehicles.
Quite. I mean, you probably don't know the answer because it's a bit out of that. So, if T-26s crossed into France, did the French at least evaluate one T-26? Probably.
As far as I remember, yes, I know. One of my colleagues at Tank Encyclopedia, she wrote an article on Republican armor that crossed into France, and from, they did evaluate T-26s, as far as I know. But again, I don't remember. I should have read this before.
I know it's outside of the. But I didn't even expect that somebody wrote about this. So
Yeah.
it was more like, oh my god, okay, maybe they wrote an evaluation report. So, anything else to add about armored cars in the Spanish Civil War for now, from your side?
Again, I think it's very much of again, it's setting some of the records straight. I guess that whilst a lot of these vehicles were improvised vehicles or quite of low quality, even then some of those were decent enough vehicles by the time that by 1937 some of them were proper vehicles. I think something that we didn't cover is that the Nationalists also build a number of these improvised armored vehicles in much smaller numbers. I think there's only about 20, 30 they built compared to the almost 400 that Republicans built. But some of them were proper designs. There was some that they built in Galicia, in the coastal northwest, just before the coup, because one of the artillery regiments there realized that something was going to happen. So they said, well, we may as well build some armored vehicles. And they built some fantastic looking armored vehicles with very beautiful armored vehicles with a turret, a Vickers style turret. So they were clearly influenced by the British there. But so even some of these like early armored vehicles of the Spanish Civil War were proper designs, which don't deserve as much mockery as they do. And most clearly, when they did get round to building these proper vehicles, again with Soviet influence, with Soviet assistance, but they were proper vehicles. And I guess the other thing is that, yeah, Spain was one of the pioneers in the use of armored vehicles before World War I was even a thing. And it's, I think, something that is worth considering and probably, again, setting the record straight and just it's worth knowing.
I mean, the main problem is sometimes that people have a bit high standards when it comes to this. Because, I mean, if you look at the Panzer I, I mean, most people laugh about the Panzer, but I made a video that is probably the most underrated German Panzer, because you need to look at it in the context of the time and what could it do. I mean, if you're an infantryman and there's a Panzer I, it's not much you can do at that point in 1939. This is what some people, and earlier as well, because as you mentioned, a 45mm gun at that point in the Spanish Civil War is a really big gun. By 1945 standards, of course, a 45mm gun is not that big of a gun, but still, very few people served in the armored forces, and very few people sit even in an armored car or an armored half-track. Most people are just still infantry or sit in a truck. And this is what sometimes people don't see. Yeah, they look at the Königstiger, yeah, of course, but how many Königstiger were there built? I mean, there were a lot of Shermans and a lot of T-34s. Then it's something different already. But still, we need to put this always in the context, and especially if, as you mentioned, in Spain, they took until the 1960s to produce an armored vehicle to that large number. Of course, then it was, I think, far more advanced, and it was also a tank. So, but still, it's, yeah, as I always say, context is very important. So this is something we should consider here. Okay, then I would say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
And be sure to check out Tank Encyclopedia, the website and the magazine. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.